Okay. Anything else that you want to ask about? All right. Well, let's get going. I'm gonna take myself off of the screen for the online people, and I always forget to do that part. Tell me what you see now. Those of you who are in the online class, do you see a slide?
Yes.
This top slide says Introduction to Politics and Policy. Is that what you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, here, at least early in the semester, I want to verify for the benefit of the online people that they're seeing what I think they're seeing. Okay? All right, so the Government 2305 course and the Government 2306 course are two different courses. But, federal government and Texas government. But at least out of the gate, in week one, the curriculum that I introduced is pretty similar in the Government 2305 and the Government 2306 course. So if you had me for Government 2305 already, I think there's at least one person there who has. I apologize to you. You're getting essentially the same sort of information that you did in that Government 2305 class, but I can't be sure that any of you who might have already taken Government 2305 with someone else got this introduction. Okay, so I do this in both the 2305 and the 2306. Okay, so this is a course in Texas politics and government. So it seems to me that a good starting point is to make sure that everybody is on the same page when it comes to those two fundamental concepts, politics and government. Okay, so I want to begin by offering you some definitions and some discussion of those two fundamental concepts. So the first definition, or the first concept that we're going to define, is politics. Now, I'm not going to just give you one definition of politics. That's not enough. Got to give you three. But I think as we go through this, I hope as we go through this, it'll become clear to you why I think the three definitions are necessary. Okay? The first definition is what I like to describe as the classic definition authored by a political scientist named Harold Laswell way back in the 1940s, 80 years ago. Harold Laswell, one of the icons of my discipline, political science, gave us this definition of politics. He actually wrote a book by the title, Who Gets What, When, and How. This has become the standard definition, and it appears in virtually every American government textbook and in many Texas government textbooks that have been printed since then. And you know what? It's pretty easy to commit to memory. One of the things that I've discovered over many, many years of teaching these introductory courses is that students like Laswell's definition, and I think mainly because it's easy for them to remember. When you come in on Tuesday for that first lecture quiz, and you see the question up on the screen, if it's one of the questions that comes up on the screen, if you see Harold Laswell define politics as A, B, C, D, E, you're going to immediately go to this because it's so easy for you to remember. In fact, Laswell's definition is so easy to remember. It's been used so often, repeated in so many textbooks, that it has really become cliche. And like a lot of cliches, they tend to lose their meaning, at least over time. If you're like me, I'm sorry for that. If you're like me, maybe you have you have a challenge understanding the meaning of cliches. Years ago, when I was living in Central Texas, I lived next door to a man named Gene. Can't remember his last name. My children called him Mr. Gene. His children are often do these days, call adults Mr. or Miss and their first name. at any rate, Gene talked almost exclusively in cliches. I would have a conversation with him and he would just be stringing all these cliches together. And I had no idea what he was talking about most of the time. I just said, okay, sure, Gene. He would say things like, well, William, you got to dance with them that brung you. You never heard that one? You got to dance with them that brung you.
You got to dance with the big weight. I can't do the math, huh, baby?
Well, he's a good old Texas boy. So you understand maybe his English usage was not, perfectly grammatical. He said, you have to dance with them that brung you. I don't want to digress too much on that cliche. My point is that I actually think I know what that would mean. But many of his cliches, I had no clue what he meant. And I think Laswell's definition is kind of like that. It's easy to remember. You're going to remember tonight as you're trying to fall asleep. It's going to torment you. You're going to be trying to go to sleep, and you're going to be hearing that phrase, you got to dance with them to bring you. At any rate, easy to remember, but it sort of leaves us scratching our head and thinking to ourselves, oh, okay, but what does that mean? Right? So that's why I introduced the second definition. This definition was offered by a political scientist named David Easton in the 1960s, also quite a long time ago. And it is also pretty commonly used in textbooks and so on, not maybe as much as Laswell's, but pretty widely used. He defined politics as the authoritative allocation of values. And it is, I think, also very easy to remember that definition. Whereas Laswell's definition is cliche, Easton's definition is jargonistic. So while it may be easy to remember, the jargon that he uses make us say, okay, well, that's fine, but what does he mean by authoritative? What does he mean by allocation? What does he mean by values? So let me start with the last of those three, because you can see that in the definition I modified it slightly. In parentheses, I put valued things. That's my modification of Easton's definition. But I don't think Easton would mind. In fact, I think he would be quite okay with that. The reason that I make that modification is because I think Easton wants us to think about this concept of values in a concrete, even material way. For a lot of us, when we hear that word values, or we think about the concept of values, we tend to think about these sort of nebulous concepts, right? These abstractions, like honesty and integrity and compassion and charity and and so on, right? And those things aren't wrong, even in this context, but I think it's harder to get where we need to go thinking about the concept of values that way. So just with this slight little modification, the authoritative allocation of valued things, what I hope is that our brains begin to think in more material or more concrete ways. So I'm going to suggest to you that there are any number of things of value in our society. By the way, the question about who values these things, the quick answer to that is the members of society. Doesn't mean that every single individual in society values these things the same. Some people value it more, that's more, generally speaking, the members of society value these things. So what's one material or concrete thing that we could, if we were going to develop a list of valued things, what's one material or concrete thing? But I'm going to suggest one to you in the interest of making some progress here, because I think this is where Easton, if he was with us today, he would take us with him. How about wealth? Is wealth something of value? Is wealth something that most members of our society value? Not each individual values it exactly the same. But in general, the members of our society value wealth. That doesn't make American society unique, by the way. I think every society on the face of the earth values wealth to a greater or lesser degree. But I think it clearly goes on the list. Now, in the past, when I've talked about these sorts of things with students, occasionally I'll have a student who will object and say, wait a minute. Think about this, Fagan. Think about what you're saying here. Politics is the authoritative allocation of wealth? Yes, that's right. It is. Politics is the authoritative allocation of wealth. Hold on. Not in my country. In America that I grew up in, a person's wealth is a consequence of his or her own talents and abilities, the decisions he or she makes. Okay? Maybe, for some people, a matter of the character that they possess, okay, etc. And I don't dispute that. I grew up believing that as well. But, and I think it is, to a large extent, true. Okay? It's not wholly and completely true, but to some extent that's true. Right? But that doesn't negate the point that Easton's trying to make to us. So I want you to imagine a fictional person called Bill Gates. He's not fictional. Any person of incredible wealth. Jeff Bezos. Somebody told me in the 1050 class that Jeff Bezos was worth, hold on to your hats, $182 billion.
So he's not the richest person in the world anymore.
Who is?
Elon.
Elon Musk, what's he worth?
He just surpassed him, I think.
So he's worth at least 182 billion. Okay?
Yeah,
anyway, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. Imagine, by the way, that's the kind of personal wealth, that's the kind of money that my brain has a really hard time coming to grips with. You know, you all know the name J.J. Watt, right? You know, when J.J. Watt signed his contract with the Houston Texans several years ago, it's been 4 or 5 years ago now, the number I remember was $100 million over 10 years. Does that sound right? So if I had said to you at the start of this class session, if I give you $1 million, will you be happy? I bet many of you would say, yeah, sure I would. But somebody might have said, now wait a minute, is that for the rest of my life? All I get $1 million? Maybe some of you would hesitate a little bit. There are a lot of people in this country that never get at any point in their life $1 million. At any rate, maybe you have higher aspirations than just $1 million. You know? So you say, so what if I change that? I say, okay, how about $1 million a year? Now you're more comfortable, right? At that rate, how many years would it take you to have J.J. Watt money? 100 years. Most of you aren't living that long. I mean, unless, you know, the average lifespan right now is like 75. I'm not living to 100, I don't think. Some people do, but most people don't, right? I hope you do. But, you know, that's a lot of money, $100 million. Now, how many years would it take you, and let's just use an easy number, instead of 182 billion, let's use 100 billion. How many years would it take you to get to Jeff Bezos' money?
like 10,000.
Well, I don't know anybody that's living that long. I think it's $100. Yeah. So that's why I say it's really hard for me to get my brain around that kind of personal wealth. You know, it's hard for me to really understand. It's a lot of money. But back on track. Okay, my point is that someone might object and say, wait a minute, the government didn't give Jeff Bezos $182 billion, or the government didn't give Bill Gates $100 billion or whatever he's worth, or Warren Buffett, whatever he's worth, or Elon Musk, whatever he's worth. Government well, I'm not defining government, I'm defining politics, first of all. That's number one. And number two, it doesn't mean that it's a direct allocation. In other words, the word allocation means to determine who gets it. In this context, it means to determine who gets it. That's one connection between Easton's definition and Laswell's definition. Laswell says the process of determining who gets, right? Easton says the process of authoritatively allocating. That's who gets, right? So the government doesn't directly allocate that money, and the political system doesn't even directly allocate that money. But I want you to imagine, go back to my original example, imagine Bill Gates, he earned his fabulous fortune, or made, pick a more a more neutral word, right? He made his massive personal fortune largely as a result of his role in creating Microsoft, right? Now, I really don't know his story to what extent. I think he was at one point a code writer, right? I don't know. He shared, the development of Microsoft was not a single-handed Bill Gates project. There were other code writers involved as well, but just to simplify things, imagine that Bill Gates had come up with this code and he lived in some other political society other than the United States. There could be other ones that it would have worked for him, but imagine, I'll be more specific, imagine he lived in those days in the 1970s in the People's Republic of China, where the laws did not respect intellectual property. I'm talking specifically about copyright. How many copies of Microsoft do you think he would have sold? A handful, and then everybody else would have just pirated it. And we wouldn't know the name Bill Gates today. Everything else is the same. His talents, his abilities, his ingenuity, his mastery of writing computer code, his mastery of marketing traffic, and what else Bill Gates might have working in his advantage. The fact that he lives in a society and he developed this product in a society that values personal property, the accumulation of wealth, personal wealth, and intellectual property. Don't underestimate that, because computer code is intellectual property. And you can copyright. And that means that you can have a monopoly on that product, at least for a period of time. And you can earn monopoly profits as a result. In that sense, the political system did allocate a massive personal fortune to Bill Gates. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Okay? So it's not in a direct sense necessarily. It could be, but it's most of the time probably not in a direct sense that we're talking about. Now, we don't just have to talk about the allocation of wealth. We could take anything of value and plug it into this definition, and it would make sense. By the way, before I finish with that point, let me just ask you, is there ever a political debate in your lifetime? Can you think of any time there's been a political debate, discussion, conflict over the question of who gets wealth? It is, to a large extent, what our politics is about. Right? Sometimes it's debated in clear and unequivocal terms. You got people like Bernie Sanders out there who want to make that. Everything is about the distribution of wealth for Bernie Sanders, right? You got others who are a little bit more nuanced about the way that they discuss it, the way they talk about it, but it is at the very center of our politics, certainly our national politics, the question of the distribution of wealth. But as I started to say, we could take anything and plug it in there and it would make sense. So, for example, education. Is education a value too? So, politics is the authoritative allocation of education? Does that make sense? Well, again, let me ask you, do we ever have political debate, discussion, conflict in our society about who gets education, when they get it, and how they get it? Yes, we do. About, have any of you, quick show of hands, how many of you have taken an economics course? Oh, wow. That's music to my ears, or my eyes. So somebody will be able to answer this question for me. How do economists define a free good? What's a free good? That's like I would think in an introductory economics course, like the first thing right out of the gate. What's the difference between a free good and an economic good?
Free good is from the buyer himself.
No, not exactly. No, that's not really what the economists are talking about. An economist will tell us that an economic good has alternative uses. Okay? A free good then is not an economic good. It doesn't have alternative uses, presumably. Okay? So one of the ways that economists try to get at this, like economics professors try to get at this with their students, is to say, give me an example of a free good. I've done that, by the way. I used to offer microeconomics classes, and my experience when I would ask students to give me an example of free good, the usual answer that came back, first thing that came back was air. Is air a free good? Does it have alternative uses? Sure it does. We can use it to breathe, right, and sustain life, or we can use it for storage space for toxic chemicals. We can dump toxic pollutants into it, and obviously the more we use air to store toxic pollutants, the less breathable air we have. By the way, does air, or at least air quality, ever become the subject of political debate, political controversy, political conflict, political discussion? Yes, of course. It is a valued thing. Clean air, or maybe just air quality. And it has to be allocated. And some people get relatively more clean air, and some people get relatively less clean air. Maybe depending on where they live, what kind of representation they have in government, right? So I hope, we can go on with examples, but I don't think we really need to. I hope the point's becoming clear. Anything that we value, something, again, think materially, think concretely, anything that we value, we could plug into this definition and it would make sense. Politics is the authoritative allocation of wealth. Yes. Politics is the authoritative allocation of clean air. Yes. Politics is the authoritative allocation of clean water. Yes. Politics is the authoritative allocation of education. Yes. And so on. I would like for you to imagine a primitive island tribal community, society, somewhere in the remote Pacific Ocean. We are unaware of the existence of this island tribal society. They are unaware of us. They have one thing of value that they keep in a big hole in the ground. And every day, whatever, use your imagination as to what it is, right? But every day, the members of this island community are permitted to line up, queue up, as our British friends say. And when their turn comes, by the way, nobody breaks the queue. Right? Nobody cuts in line, as Americans would say. The British would say breaks the queue. Right? They line up, and when their time comes, they're permitted to dip into this hole and take out as much as they possibly can and cart it back to their individual family dwelling and consume it until they're satiated. And then the next morning they do it again. And then the next day they do it again and again and again, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, maybe decade after decade. But you've lived long enough to know that at some point what's likely to happen. they're going to recognize that they're running out of this thing. By the way, up until that point, it's a free good. At that point, it becomes an economic good. And by the way, that's when the pushing and shoving in line starts. That's when the cuts begin to happen. The biggest, strongest members of the community push their way to the front. I'm not physically. They take as much as they want and leave slim pickings for the rest. It's the law of the jungle. The strongest survive, right? On the other hand, maybe the members of our island community have developed more civilized notions, and they develop a process whereby all of the members of the island community can share in some. We'll call that the rule of law. So on one extreme, you have the law of the jungle. On the other extreme, you have the rule of law. Either way, it's politics. Okay? They're both politics. That's what we're talking about when we talk about politics. They've developed a process for determining who gets the valued things, when they get the valued things, and how they get the valued things. Obviously, there are lots of variations in between those two extremes. Okay? But every human society has to confront that reality of scarcity. And it is the fact of scarcity that makes politics unavoidable. I had a student in a class years ago. I'm always going to remember this because she said, after a similar discussion, she said, well, that's not right. I said, what do you mean, my description's not accurate, or you don't think that's fair? And she said, no, I mean, I think it's not fair. It shouldn't be that way. And I said, I don't think she liked this part of it very much. I said, well, don't be so naive. If your notion is that, as hers was, that politics should be about doing what's right for everyone, I say to you, grow up. Stop being so naive. If anyone can ever tell me what is good for everyone, I will retract that statement and say I was wrong. But beyond some very, very general notions about, well, the country should be at peace and it should be prosperous, everybody can agree on that. It's what political scientists call a valence issue. Something everybody agrees on because it's so universally accepted. But beyond that, if I was to say, okay, how do we promote prosperity and how do we keep the peace, that unanimity begins to break down very quickly. In fact, it may be difficult in many cases, next to impossible, to even get consensus on how we do those things. So the truth of the matter is that the things that we value as a society are scarce, and so there has to be some process for allocating them. So you can see, I think you probably can, see the connection between Easton's definition and life. They're saying the same thing, aren't they? They're not saying something different. The allocation in Easton's definition is the process of determining who gets it in Laswell's definition, and the valued things in Laswell's definition are the what in Easton. Excuse me, I said that backwards. The valued thing in Easton's definition is the what in Laswell's definition. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you my definition of politics, not because I think it's better than the Laswell definition or the Easton definition. I'm not that full of myself. I probably should be embarrassed to even include mine up there with Easton's or Laswell's. These two icons, as I said, of my profession. But I offer you this definition because I think it says explicitly what we can only infer from Laswell and Easton's definition. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the word competitive. If everything that we've said up to this point is accurate, and it is, then politics is going to be a competitive process. If the things that we value in society are scarce, see, it says it explicitly here, scarce, all right? Scarce resources, valued things. What? So if the things that we value have value because of their scarcity, then people are going to be in competition with one another over these things. And there has to be some process for determining who gets them, when they get them, and how they get them. And that means, because it's competitive, that means that there are going to be winners and losers. And again, if that's something that doesn't sit well with you, you're uncomfortable with that idea, again, because maybe you have this idea that politics should be about what's good for everyone, you're just going to have to accept it. Because it's the reality. In politics, there are winners and losers. Now, it doesn't have to be an absolute kind of thing. Something called a zero-sum game, where someone or some group wins absolutely everything and the other group none. We're not saying that some individuals or some groups get all the wealth and others get no wealth, or all the education and no education, or all the clean air and no clean air. Right? That's not what we're saying. It's not absolute winners and losers, but we certainly can think about it in relative terms. Some people are relative winners and some people are relative losers. Some people get relatively more wealth, some people get relatively less wealth. Some people get relatively more education, some people get relatively less education. Some people get relatively more clean air, some people get relatively less clean air. Okay? Again, that's just the fact. That's just the reality of life in an earthly society. When we all die and go to heaven, and there is no want and need, right? We won't have any use for politics. There's one other thing that this definition explicitly says that you can only infer. In fact, it's only after quite a bit of reflection and discussion that you can infer this. So I go ahead and state it explicitly in the definition. It's politics is the process whereby a society determines its priorities. The way that we allocate wealth, the way that we allocate education, and all these other things of value says something about our priorities. Even in the more narrow sense of thinking about how government allocates its budget. Right? If I gave you the assignment to go find a budget of the United States, a copy of the budget of the United States for fiscal year 2020, and assuming you could make your way through that very thick document, many pages of document of government outlays and appropriations and so on, you could come away with some understanding of our priorities as a society, at least as articulated by our government in Washington. For example, if you could conclude that the government is allocating more budgetary resources to defense operations than to human services or environmental initiatives or whatever the specifics are that you're looking at, you could reach some conclusions about our priorities as a society. As articulated through our elected representatives. I do understand, appreciate that many people believe that that connection is not as between the members of society and their elected representatives is not as direct as I'm making it sound. Okay, so those are your three definitions of politics. Now let's move on to government. I want to begin, this is our second major concept that we start off with in this class. I want to define government I want to say that many textbooks define government as the legitimate use of force. That is something that is very commonly found in introductory government textbooks, but as you might expect, I have some issues with defining government that way. But let's just, before we move on and give you my definition of government, let me get you to reflect a little bit on what the authors of textbooks mean when they say that. So, just a quick show of hands here. Why do you obey the speed limit to the extent that you do?
Fear of punishment.
So, you're saying that it's the incentive or the disincentive of a punishment that dissuades you from violating the speed limit. I think that's the answer most people are going to get, right? And by the way, that is one way that government exercises force. They're going to make you pay this fine. But that really just shifts the burden, right? Because the next question I'm going to ask you to consider is, well, why do you accept the fine? Why do you pay the fine? Oh, because if you don't, government will ratchet up the force on another level, right? Maybe they come and put you in jail for a while until you kind of see reason and agree to pay your fines, right? Why do we accept government's use of force as legitimate?
Well, I mean, the way I'm thinking about it is like, like paying the fees. I mean, like they supply like public services.
Well, that's very highly evolved thinking on your part. There was no less a person than former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was once asked, according to the story that we don't know if it's apocryphal or true, I guess, I suspect it's apocryphal, but one of his law clerks asked him, don't you hate paying taxes? And he said, no, sonny boy, I love paying taxes. With them I buy civilization. So there is that aspect of it. And so, I would say you're probably in a minority, though, unless people are pressed. I think sometimes when people are pressed, they can get there. But to so quickly recognize that you're getting something for what you're paying,
There's a lot of places that don't offer what we offer.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Well, but there's something else there because, as I said, most people don't really go there. Yes, sir.
There's also kind of like a general morality of it, because like speeding morally can be wrong because you can cause danger to others, and they realize that, and they should, pay their fine because morally that would be the right thing.
Oh, so as a logical creature, you're concluding that it is actually a good thing to allow the government to control people's speed when they get behind the wheel of a car. But you see some benefit in it for you, but also the other members of society. This is a rational conclusion that you're reaching. Again, some people probably do think about it that way. But I think there's something else. Okay, so let me ask you this. Let me sort of steer this a little bit different direction. Let's say you get in your car after this class session is over and you are headed to get some lunch. You haven't had lunch already. And you're driving up there you get up on 69 and you see in your rearview mirror the flashing lights. And so true to your driver's training, you pull over and you see some guy in a uniform striding up to your window, there's license and registration. You comply, but as you do so, you notice that he has a badge on his uniform that says First calling mall security.
You'll be
He's
like,
writing you a ticket. He has his thing. Sign. What are you gonna do? You're gonna just like laugh and blow it?
Yeah.
Huh. What if his badge said Archdiocese of Houston Galveston? He's a security officer for the Catholic Church. You don't pay that ticket or worry about driving away?
They're like an authoritative power over that.
What if his badge says Fagan's Goons? By the way, my goons, they can exert some force. They are well-paid goons. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? What if his badge says City of Sugarland, Texas, or Texas Department of Public Safety, or Texas whatever they call the Highway Patrol? I forgot what they call it. What if it's a City of Sugarland police officer?
Yeah.
Now it's a different story, right? Now you take that ticket and you sign that ticket and you keep your court date because you recognize that as government, and government is legitimate in your view. You may not like everything government does, but you view government as being legitimate. So that raises an interesting question. Where does that notion of legitimacy come from? Why do the members of a society, and let's modify this a little bit. Let's talk specifically about the members of a democratic society, because I think we could talk about this a little bit differently if we wanted to talk about an authoritarian society. Okay? But this is, of course, in Texas government, which is part of the broader U.S. system, right? So why is it that in American society, in democratic societies more generally, it's not unique to the United States, why do people see government's use of force as legitimate? For our purposes, legitimacy here means the willingness of the members of a society to accept the authority of government. And that includes its use of force. Willingness to accept the authority of government, its decisions and actions as appropriate, and thereby binding on the members of society. Why do you see the City of Sugarland's authority as binding on your behavior to control your speed, but not First Colony Mall, or a private business, or the Catholic Church, a religious institution, or William Fagan, a private citizen? Why do you not recognize those as having legitimate authority, but you do recognize government as having legitimate authority? All the things that you all have said to me, I think, are true, but ultimately, I think it's simpler than that. We have, somewhere along the way, picked up the idea that government's authority is legitimate because ultimately its authority comes from us. Right? You know those three little words that open the Constitution? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union and establish justice, domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, etc., etc., blah, 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 blah. We do establish and ordain this government and give it the authority to govern over us and make these kinds of decisions. That authority comes from us, we believe. And that's why it's legitimate. It is those three little words that the Americans wrote in their Constitution in 1787 was the reflection of an ideal that was being developed in Western thought, particularly during a period known as the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is mainly the 18th century, the 1700s. And it's worth noting that the fundamental documents of American political life, the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the Constitution, 1787, and the Bill of Rights, 1789, were all written during the Age of Enlightenment. and they reflect Enlightenment principles and Enlightenment ideas. And one very important Enlightenment principle and ideal for us is this principle of popular sovereignty. You know, up until that time, Westerners, think Europeans, had believed that the king got his authority from God. Heard of the divine right theory? The idea that the king gets his authority from God. By the way, if I'm king and I get my authority from God, who are you to challenge me? Because if you challenge me, you challenge God. And what a perfect defense of absolute rule that is. Well, the Enlightenment thinkers came along in the 1700s and said, he gets his authority from God. The king gets his authority from the people. You know, we don't have a king, obviously, but more generally, government gets its authority from the people. Okay? So that's the notion of popular sovereignty. The people ultimately have political authority, not the individuals in government. So the related concept then is the consent of the governed. The decisions and actions of government are considered legitimate only when government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. By the way, did you know that Jefferson wrote his own epitaph on his tombstone at Monticello? You didn't know. Have you ever been to Monticello?
When I was taking History 1, I got to see like a virtual thing.
If you ever have an opportunity to actually visit Monticello, it's worthwhile. Right? It's very good. You know where it is? In Virginia. Yeah. Three things he identified as his most significant contributions to the new nation, the United States, and to the world. Anybody know what they are? The founder of the University of Virginia. Jefferson was absolutely committed to education. Thought it was critical. Right? Founder of the University of Virginia. Author of the Statutes of Religious Freedom for Virginia. Jefferson is the main person who argues for separation of church and state. Okay? And third, author of the Declaration of Independence. Those are his three. In his view, nothing on there about his presidency, nothing on there about the Louisiana Purchase, nothing on there about his scientific contributions. Jefferson's mind, he believed that those were his three most significant contributions and worthy of inscription on his tombstone. So if we could ask Mr. Jefferson, with that in mind, to dig him up and bring him up in here and ask him the question, Mr. Jefferson, why do we have government? I'm convinced that he would be so sad. His shoulders would sag, his back would curve, his head would slump, and he would say, you haven't read my declaration. Because he tells us in the Declaration of Independence, in a very concise way, why we have government and where government gets its authority from. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men. That's why we have government, that to secure these ends, these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's where government gets its authority. It derives its just powers. It's legitimate. Substitute for the word just, legitimate. It derives its legitimate powers from the consent of the governed. Not from God, okay? Not from power or force, but from the consent of the governed. So these two concepts are closely interconnected and are critical concepts for us in understanding the American system, which includes the Texas political system. All right, so let's define government here. Government refers to the structured arrangements in a society that produces and enforces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. This is not the same definition that's offered by the authors of the textbook. So again, I don't want you to think about everything in this class in terms of quizzing. I think sometimes that gets in the way of learning. The students are too obsessed with quizzing or testing. So I do understand that I run the risk of fostering that kind of approach when I say things like I'm about to say. When you come into this classroom on Tuesday, the lecture quiz, and you see government is defined as, if it's one of the questions that makes it on the screen, A, B, C, and D, you're going to pick this. You're not going to pick the one however it's described in the textbook. That makes sense? Okay, but again, quizzing aside, I think I need to emphasize why I think this definition is useful. So first of all, starting at the very end, you see the connection here between the definition of government and the definition of politics, because in our discussion of how we define politics, we talked at length about the fact that it's the scarcity of resources that creates a need for a political process. So you know by intuition that politics and government go together. I mean, I think not just as students in this class, but just as intelligent individuals. You know, really almost by intuition, that there is a intimate connection between politics and government. But one of the points that I want to emphasize to you is that they're not the same thing. Politics and government are not the same thing. The political system and government are not the same thing. We call this course Texas Government, but I think it would be better labeled the Texas Political System. If you looked at the course syllabus before you came to class today, particularly the last several pages where all the topics are listed, you saw topics listed there on the Texas legislature, the Texas executive branch, local government, right? The Texas judiciary. So we do talk about in a systematic way government in this course. But there are a lot of other topics on that syllabus that are not specifically government. There's a topic on the Texas political culture. There's a topic on political parties and interest groups. Political parties, by the way, are not government. They're external to government. You see what I'm saying about the concept of political system or politics is broader than the concept of government. There's a connection there, but government is smaller, so to speak, than the political system. I said you know almost by intuition. You probably also know by intuition that what I'm saying about them not being synonymous is true, because many of you probably recognize that there are politics in a lot of other kinds of institutions that aren't government, right? There's politics in sports. There's politics in education. There's politics in churches. There's politics in Little League Baseball. That's one of my favorites. I used to be, when my son was little, intimately involved in Little League Baseball. And trust me, if you don't have the personal experience, you may be able to appreciate this. Just, oh yeah, it makes sense, but the extent to which Little League Baseball is immersed in politics is incredible. Which teams get the best players, which team for every compete over, right? I'm talking about just not what they compete over, irrespective of the competition on the field. There's politics in marriages. Virtually every human institution has some sort of political aspect to it. Which means, by the way, that all of the frailties of human behavior are present in all of those institutions and not just in government. Like I'm talking about like corruption. People can clearly see the corruption in government, right? And they tend to think that that's all it is, corruption. But corruption in everything human beings lay their hands on. So politics is the bigger term, government is the smaller term. So that's number one. You can see the connection between the two, but we keep in mind that they're not the same thing, right? The other thing I want to point your attention to is that use of the term structured arrangements. And what I really mean by that is just that it's not random. Government's not just random thing. There's some structure and form to it. We tend to think about in our society, and I think, again, this is not something that's unique to the American system, certainly in democratic societies, but I think in other kinds of systems as well, people tend to think about government in terms of structures and institutional arrangements. We think about institutions like the Congress and the presidency and the courts and the bureaucracies and so on as institutions. And it's certainly correct to do that, but I also want you to recognize that it doesn't have to be. So imagine some sort of society that's governed by warlords, where you have this warlord who has these very loyal henchmen, and they are heavily armed, and they go out and enforce what they choose to enforce in their zone of control. That's a form of government. But it's not structured in any real sense, or it's not institutionalized in any real sense. Certainly in the early 21st century, and certainly in democratic societies, most of the time we're talking about some sort of institutionalized arrangement. Okay? All right, questions or comments over any of that? All right, so the last thing we can touch on here real quick, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these points, is oftentimes it's helpful to us to use adjectives to label a system of government so that we can make comparisons or draw contrast with other systems of government. So here are some very common labels that we can use. I actually put them here in the form of a noun. That's a noun. Democracy is that's the part of speech. It's a noun, right? So if you change it to the adjective form, democratic, and then the noun would be system of government, right? Democratic system of government. A democratic system of government operates according to the principles of popular sovereignty and consent of the governed. At a minimum, a democracy operates according to the principles of popular sovereignty and liberty. You can't get to democracy unless you embrace the principle of popular sovereignty and consent of the governed. I suppose it's possible that one could embrace the principles of popular sovereignty and consent of the governed without necessarily getting to democracy. Does that make any sense? Let me say it again. I don't think you can get to democracy. I don't think you can reach the conclusion and embrace democracy without first accepting these principles. Okay? It may be possible to embrace these principles of popular sovereignty and consent of the governed and not get to democracy. I'm thinking here about the way that the Bolsheviks or the communists in Russia used to talk about their system, where the Communist Party governed as a vanguard of the people. I think that they might have at least believed, convinced themselves that they were, acting in the interest of the people. But it wasn't a terribly democratic system. Next, an autocratic system of government is one in which one person possesses and exercises supreme and absolute authority. An autocracy or an autocratic system of government is one in which one person possesses and exercises supreme and absolute authority. That's straightforward. I think it's pretty straightforward, right? A plutocracy is a system of government in which authority is possessed by and exercised on behalf of people of great wealth. I think most political scientists who study the American system would say that the American system is a democracy. But I do want you to be aware that there are some people out there, particularly people who have agendas, political agendas, who are active in politics, who might tell you that our system is a plutocracy. That's what they see. Like people of great wealth who are pulling all the strings, and government runs for their benefit and so on. I'm sorry, what?
Buying politicians and lobbying.
Yeah. But I think I just want to be clear, I think most political scientists would tell you that it is accurate to describe our system as a democracy. Not all democracies are created the same. They operate differently. So there's lots of room under that label democracy to have some variations. For example, I would tell you, I don't want to digress too much because we're almost out of time, but I would say that we certainly don't have a majoritarian democracy. It is probably more accurate to describe it as a pluralist democracy, but even there's some room for debate on that. But that's a whole other kind, set of considerations for us that we don't have time to go into right now. All right, a theocracy is a system of government in which God or some deity is widely accepted as the supreme ruling authority, but gives divine guidance to clerics who act as human intermediaries to carry out divine will. Maybe some people would point you to, I'm not going to do this because I don't want to show ignorance, because I'm not an expert on this, but I guess some people would probably point you to the Islamic Republic of Iran as a theocracy. I'm sorry?
They're more
Autocratic.
The Vatican's a good one.
Well, but the Vatican, its governing authority, that's an interesting question. It's a complicated way to, my initial instinct is to say, well, the governing authority of the Vatican only applies to Vatican City, which is, just the Holy See is, I'm not a Catholic. I don't want to speak out of school, but on the other hand, someone might say, well, but, it extends to all Catholics, worldwide. But I don't know that we really think about it as a government per se, except as it applies to Vatican City. Okay. All right, we're out of time.